Azure Active Directory has been officially replaced with Entra something. I'm going to start with this.
All hail Entra. Here it is.
Okay, so I'm gonna start out with this. The news article, if I can find it here, announcing new innovations. I have way too many tabs open. Essentially, Microsoft's product announcement around this was that Microsoft or Azure Active Directory is becoming Entra ID.
Microsoft Entra ID. You got to make sure you get the full thing in there.
Got to make sure I get Microsoft. So I want to take some initial beef with just this because I don't even know where I want to start with this. It's Microsoft Entra ID, but if you go look at everything else, so there's a bunch of references out there. This has been my question around a lot of this. What is hybrid Azure Active Directory become? What does all these other products essentially turn into? And nobody is replacing Azure Active Directory with these product names with Entra ID. They're always replacing it with Entra. I think this should be that Azure AD was renamed Entra, or Azure AD was absorbed into Entra, and now the portion of Entra where you manage users is called Entra ID. Doesn't make as flashy of a headline, but that's kind of my initial takeaway with this.
So Entra remain. I think the easiest way to think about it is maybe like, let's take a step back. So there's an article out on Docs, which is called, helpfully titled, New Name for Azure Active Directory. And I think if you take that, like, let's just start right there. Like, okay, there's a new name for Azure Active Directory, and that is Azure Active Directory coming fully under the Entra brand, which we kind of knew, right? Like Entra was this identity suite and suite of security, identity-focused security products and things like that. And now Azure AD is becoming Microsoft Entra ID. As a part of coming in to Entra ID, it's an opportunity to go back and clean up potentially some of those other things that you talked about. So for something like an Azure AD joined client, you can just become an Entra joined client, even though, like, yes, you are technically a Microsoft Entra ID joined thing. I don't know if this gives like more flexibility down the line. I imagine it does. Like if you ever want to move away from that functionality or disambiguate it from what was the identity provider, I don't know how you do that at this point and disentangle those two things. But whatever happens. So thankfully, licensing stays the same for the most part. Like you can take the phrase Azure Active Directory. So say you had like an Azure Active Directory premium P1 license. Now you have a Microsoft Entra ID P1 license or a Microsoft Entra ID P2 license. Where it starts to get weird is in some of the things that leave licensing land. And that's things like, well, I had an Azure Active Directory tenant, and now my Azure Active Directory tenant is a Microsoft Entra tenant, not an ID tenant. It's just an Entra tenant, which you think about it, it kind of makes sense because, hey, as a holistic, like, big thing that sits on top of it, like I kind of get it. And at the same time, I kind of don't. Marketing is going to market. Like we said this a whole bunch in the past, and this like initiative, like if you just take a step back and you go like, okay, like what's going on? Like this is really a rename. Like we'll put aside the new functionality announcements because like there is net new stuff there or things I think that people have been potentially sitting on until this was coming. But Azure AD to Microsoft Entra ID is just totally a rename and the same exact thing. One of the clearest explanations I've seen of this, not surprising, does not exist inside of Microsoft documentation. It is John Saville over on YouTube. Once again, I would recommend everybody just go watch that, where I think he breaks it down very clearly, like, it was this, and now it's this, and there's literally no new functionality there. And if you want to learn about the new functionality, he does have another video that's much longer. I think like his one on the rename is like 4 or 5 minutes. It's pretty short. And then he's got like a 50-minute to follow it up on, hey, here's the things that are changing in the stack as Microsoft enters the SSE space and tries to play a little bit more over there. So we shall see. This does have, like, I think, wide-reaching ramifications just on the documentation side. So back to, hey, there's 1.5 million mentions of that across all these various properties. There's 144K entries just across learn.microsoft.com, which is like, official docs, put aside like learn materials and all the units and things like that. So all of that branding effort has to go on first, and there's no immediate or downstream impact to existing properties. So if you have existing commandlets, you have SDKs, like, oh, you're over here using the Microsoft Graph, and Microsoft Graph creates users in what was Azure Active Directory, and it's now Microsoft Entra ID, like, the graph endpoints do not change. The name of those endpoints do not change. The SDKs do not change. PowerShell doesn't change, anything like that. I would preface, I guess I would like amend that to say those do not change today. Who knows what happens in the future as some of this comes around. I'm sure there's going to be renames in other places and other things that are going to have to bleed into client tooling, SDKs, APIs, all that kind of stuff. But this is purely a front. I think it'll have to in some ways. But
look at PowerShell. So look at PowerShell for Teams, where it still has CS in there, which was what Microsoft Communication Services, which like predated Link, and they still haven't updated some of that stuff.
I think a lot of that is
that will.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff is driven by there's this weird line. There's the way things are named publicly, and there's the way that users have been consuming those things if they've been in market for some time. So I know, I'm on the Azure side, right? I work in Azure storage. I'm RPM for all of our SDKs and our client tools like AZ Copy, things like that. Like, I am very sensitive to putting customers in a position where they have to take any kind of a breaking change. And sometimes, like, us changing a method name is a major deal for a customer, and it's a breaking change. So we bend over backwards not to do that. And sometimes that's at the expense of leaving the old names and things in there. Like, you just don't want to break every PowerShell script out there. You don't want to break, say, like a couple weeks ago, we were talking about Terraform and that it has an Azure AD Terraform provider inside of it. Like, you don't want to break that. Like, that stuff's in market and it's ready to go. So old stuff, like, no, but new stuff, I think it's certainly in play, as long as it's not confusing to customers. Like, you can't start mixing commandlets or API names like in the same space for the same piece of functionality. But if there's something net new, like all this SSE stuff, security service edge stuff, SSE, when you're playing over on that side, that's an opportunity to start to go down a different path, and you really don't have to worry about like disambiguating anything because it's just the way it was. So you're kind of all set. So I'll go back to, like, you and I were chatting about this earlier, because there's a bunch of nuance to some of these things. Like back in that new name for Azure Active Directory article, they actually talk about what's not going to be renamed as well. So there's a bunch of existing properties, like Microsoft Graph stays Microsoft Graph, MSOL, the Microsoft Authentication Library, that still stays as MSOL, Graph PowerShell, still Graph PowerShell. On-premises Active Directory, so Windows Active Directory, I guess Windows Server Active Directory, and anything associated with that stays the same. So things like ADFS, Azure or Active Directory Domain Services, and Active Directory Federation Services, and then you've got Active Directory Domain Services, which is ADDS. Those stay the same because those are just on-prem Active Directory. There's this thing in Azure, which is called Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is going to be renamed to Microsoft Entra Domain Services, which, funny enough, the perfect product to call Azure Active Directory would be what is running domain services as a PaaS service, right? Like, that was the great opportunity that was missed here, but whatever. What do I know?
That one's weird. The other one that's going to be a little strange in this is Azure Active Directory B2C. And that one's called out in here under experiences that aren't impacted. And this one's interesting to me. And then it says Azure Active Directory B2C will continue to be available as an Azure service, which this one is kind of funny too, because when you go create an Azure AD B2C instance, it creates another tenant. And if you go to that tenant, it literally says Azure Active Directory, and it's just different functionality. But I think this is going to be available as a service only for a limited amount of time, because you start digging through the documentation. And there's this article out there that talks about planning for customer identity and access management, which has a lot of the similar things to Azure B2C in terms of like federating with Facebook or federating with Google and building your apps on top of this customer identity and access management. And there's also all these articles about Microsoft Entra External ID public preview that's developer-centric. And there's other articles too, and I think it's maybe in one of the blog posts where it does start talking about this Microsoft Entra External ID. It's the customer identity. It's like that thing that has 5 different names. Well, Azure AD B2C is going to exist as a service for now. If you start reading through all this different documentation and looking at it, it appears that it is going to go away and it's going to get absorbed. It's going to evolve into this Microsoft Entra External ID. I think it's staying as a service because they're not doing a rename and keeping the service the same. It wouldn't appear. Is that eventually, I would guess, and this is just pure speculation on my part, that we're going to see that service deprecated and all of the functionality moved into a new product called some form of Microsoft Entra External ID customer identity something or other.